Hello everyone. So this video is for the medical ethics course that I was running during the past week at Juntendo University in Tokyo, and we already covered quite a lot of ground during the face-to-face classes, and now those who attended and those who are interested can watch 7 additional videos. And the first one of these will be based largely on Louis Vaughn's wonderful book on bioethics. It's a great introduction, which also contains many important tests. I'm using the 5th edition, and today's short video will be based mostly on chapter 10. The main topic here is euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. In the class, we already covered some of the basics, right? So some countries do allow active euthanasia, which is killing someone at their own request. But an example is the Netherlands, Switzerland, some states in the US. But usually, for example, in the Netherlands, very strict conditions have to be met. And the first one is that the patient faces interminable, never-ending, and unbearable suffering. So your condition has to be very bad. You must be suffering from some kind of disease or other health issue that really makes your life terrible and very low quality, and this is not going to change. Interminable, cannot be stopped. The request to die is voluntary and well considered. Voluntariness plays a very significant role here. Voluntary usually means that something that happens is in line with what is very deeply important for you and essential to who you are. It's your considered will. And well considered, that's criterion, which means that people cannot get approved for euthanasia very quickly. There's no fast tracking. This process is deliberately built up in a way to make it somewhat slow so that people don't decide too rashly and spend enough time talking to friends, family, experts, doctors and others, psychologists, and they think enough about what it means that they ask, namely to die. The doctor and the patient must be convinced that there is no other solution, right? So the quality of life has to be so bad that both the doctor and the patient have to agree that the best way out is to die. And this can happen. Some conditions lead people to a point in life where people are not able to read or talk to their loved ones. They're very tired or in very great pain all the time, or both. And at that point, the quality of life can drop below a level where most people would feel that it does not make sense to go on. In fact, it's worse to go on than not to go on. Again, this is usually at a point where people are so unwell or so weak, or both, that they cannot enjoy even basic things like eating or watching a TV show because it's too much for their condition. And there has to be a second medical opinion which confirms the third point. So one doctor cannot approve this, usually a separate independent doctor who is working at a far away and unconnected institution has to arrive at the same conclusion after looking carefully through all the patient's data and talking to the patient. And then life has to be such that it can be ended in a medically appropriate way. What that means is that if someone has a condition where we don't know as of yet how to kill them humanely in a way that's not painful and slow and horrible for them and their family, and not traumatizing for the doctor and the other staff who need to set this up, then they can be allowed to die, gain permission. This is again, of course, very important, not simply because if we allow people to ask for support with death, that opens the door to the danger of some people making an unconsidered choice, or some people being pressured or coerced, or some people being brainwashed either by the dominant culture, or saying you're not useful anymore, you're not creating any value in society anymore, you don't have a function anymore, you're a burden, or by their family. In some cases, relations are not good in the family, or people stand to gain quite a bit in terms of inheritance, or less burden if someone dies, and some people are just not making nice choices for whatever reason. Maybe they are themselves in a bad place psychologically, maybe they're just greedy, and they pressure all people to choose death. So we need to take these risks into account. We also need to take into account, of course, that historically there have been governments and political parties, especially the Nazis in Germany, but also if you think about some very heavy-handed paternalistic interventions, there have been several of this in the UK, France, and the US. So we got to be careful with how these things are structured and allowed. So voluntariness is a very, very important thing. Now, what is euthanasia? Just very quickly, this is from Tony Hope's wonderful Medical Ethics, a very short introduction book, which is published by OUP. The definitions: euthanasia is when X, so one person, an agent, kills Y, another person, for that person's benefit, right? So someone wants to die, and another person, physician, nurse, a doctor, helps them to die. Active euthanasia is when X, usually this is the physician, has to perform an action which kills Y, right? This could be giving a large dose of some kind of medicine that helps people fall asleep and stops their breathing or stops their heart. Passive euthanasia would be when X allows Y to die by not giving or taking away from Y some treatment that could lengthen the life of Y. Right, so we're going to talk about a case like that in more detail. Voluntary euthanasia is when Y wants to die and understands what is involved, and this reflects their values and goals. And the person also asks, so it's documented by witnesses officially, and they put it in writing, or they made a video, and they say this consistently to their physician and other people who are involved in the process, their family, their friends, their partner, their lawyer, their psychologist. And non-voluntary euthanasia would be when the patient cannot express any preferences. This can happen if you're talking about a child who is just newborn and severely disabled. Maybe that child will never be able to express any preferences. Maybe it's just because they're very young. But some severe disabilities might be so bad that it might be better to let someone die rather than force them to go through a life of, say, continuous significant suffering. There might be horribly injured people. Think about car crashes and other kinds of accidents where people are unconscious and they might be beyond saving. If you let someone like that die, and then that's non-voluntary euthanasia, because they are it's not necessarily against their will. We can imagine that if people in these situations, if they could, would often say that yes, I would want to rather die. But if you're talking about children or very, very old people with Alzheimer's, dementia, they don't have the abilities, the skills, the capacities needed to express ideas and even to think about something like that, to form a considered preference, to have an idea about their own life. And obviously unconscious people might have the capacities needed, but they are not able to use them. Involuntary euthanasia would be where X kills Y, or lets Y die against Y's wishes, right? So this is different from voluntary euthanasia, where someone wants to die. Um, in these cases, the person does not necessarily want to die, um, but someone thinks that it's for some reason better for that person to die. So it's not like it's better for other people if this person dies, right? Like in a death sentence of a criminal, it's better for society somehow, or the victims, or justice, or some other institution or concept or person. If somebody dies, it should be best for the person who is killed or let die, but that person doesn't see it that way. Now, obviously, this is very, very controversial, and in most cases, we think that this cannot be justified. Whereas non-voluntary euthanasia is something that we can often think could be justified, and it's one of those cases where we have to think very carefully about who is going to make a decision for us, right? Usually, this is set up in a way in most developed legal systems that your partner would be the first one who would be asked, and they would be asked, what would you want to be done to you? Let's say you had a really bad accident or a bad stroke, and in that case, you say your heart stops, would you want to be resuscitated? And should the doctors, nurses save you, even if you might be unconscious or heavily disabled, or you might have lost some very important capacities like speech, or some of your memories, or thinking abilities, or movement coordination due to your injuries or medical problems. If your partner cannot, if you don't have a partner, or they cannot decide this, or the medical staff feels that they are not really taking your interest into consideration, then if you have adult children, they would be the next ones who would be involved. And if you don't have adult children, then probably your parents or wider family would be consulted. Also, people can, of course, make a will, right? So there are different kinds of advanced directives where someone is still healthy or someone is still alive and has all their capacities to make a rational, considered choice and form a voluntary preference. Such a person makes, say, a video statement in the presence of a lawyer, and it's confirmed that the video is authenticated. So often this has to be taken to a public registrar, and the registrar needs witnesses who confirm that you made this video. The same with the will. You need to have a will signed and declared in front, usually, of someone who is a legal professional, has the authority to confirm that this is authentic. Of course, this is to prevent abuse. If there would be no such rule, then anyone could present a document that they wrote saying that this is your will and you wanted to leave everything to me, or you wanted a quick, painless death and me to inherit all your wealth. Of course, this would be really easy to abuse, hence the need to get authorization and the authority of the document or other way of making a will confirmed. Right, so there are many kinds of taking care of these kids. Now, the case discussed in the chapter by Vaughn in his book, and it's chapter 10, Euthanasia and Physician-Assisted Suicide, is a very interesting case. It's about a woman who lived in the US. Her name was Terri Schiavo, and she had different kinds of health problems, and for some reason, she was 26, 27, her heart stopped for a couple of seconds probably, and she fell, and she suffered brain damage, and she went into a coma. She was saved, but she was in a persistent vegetative state, so it looked as if she would be awake, which is very deceiving and very heart-wrenching, because your family might be watching and saying, oh, this person is not in a coma, they are, look, they're reacting to light, or moving. But often these are reflex movements that have nothing to do with our higher order capacities to control our movement and react to our environment, but are lower level, very basic processes that even a heavily damaged brain could keep going. So in Terri's case, for example, most of the time she didn't need ventilation, but she did need, for example, feeding. So she had a gastrointestinal tube inserted through which they fed her and kept her alive. And almost everyone agreed, who was an expert, that there is no chance of significant improvement. She has been kept alive for a long, long time, and there's a very interesting situation surrounding her. She had a husband who really seems to have loved her, and parents who were still alive, maybe late middle-aged, right? So she was still quite young. And so her husband and her parents worked together fairly well in the first years to keep her alive, take care of her, look for different institutions that could try different treatments to maybe help her recover. But nothing worked, and at some point her husband became her legal guardian and claimed that Terri, at some earlier stage in life, and they were talking about issues like this, said she would not want to be artificially sustained and kept alive this way. And she was a very vibrant, energetic, attractive person who cared about her appearance and being active and involved in life. And at some point, I think this happened about after maybe 8 years of having looked after her, Michael, the husband, said that, look, it would be best to let her die with dignity. So if they would have removed the feeding tube from her stomach, and she would have stopped receiving nutrition, then her body would have weakened, and at some point probably her heart would have stopped, and she would have died in a coma, so hopefully relatively quickly, and maybe not conscious of the pain of the death. This kind of death is never painless, of course, but if you're maybe deeply unconscious, we don't know exactly. Hopefully people don't experience much of it or don't experience it. Now, Terri's parents didn't agree. They were still holding out hope for whatever reason. I don't know the case in detail. There might have been religious reasons, there might have been personal convictions, or they might simply have been loving parents who could not let their daughter go, and they were holding on to some hope that there might be some treatment invented at some point, or she just miraculously recovers. And it became a huge issue. Even some politicians offered their ideas, not very helpfully. They didn't really understand much of the medical side. They didn't actually check the patient themselves. And it is a really big question then whether it would be murder to remove the feeding tube, withdrawing some treatment that kept her alive, or whether this would just be a permissible act of mercy. Now, mercy killing is in general discouraged in medicine, and also in war, because often we might think that, oh, someone is injured, or someone could die very easily, but there are very, very few cases where we can know this for certain. And for example, when it comes to the setting of war, if someone is severely injured, then they're not a combatant anymore, they're unable to fight on. So the enemy does not have the right to kill that person, and they should take that person as a prisoner according to the relevant procedures and provide them with medical care, right? Or your own side should try and save you and provide medical care. Shooting someone who has already been injured, saying that, oh, we're just putting them out of their misery, is murder, still in a military context. In medical context, it's of course trickier. As we saw, pain can be long-term and unbearable. There are many conditions where this can become the case. And we talked in the class about the Dr. Cox case, where Dr. Cox had a patient who was really in a long-term, very strong pain, and she was begging the physicians looking after her to be allowed to die. So maybe mercy makes more sense in this context, and it comes up, of course, more often. So should Terri have been allowed to die? Terri's husband and her parents were fighting legal battles in different courts, made different rulings. The governor of Florida, Jeff Bush, made some regulation that tried to prevent withdrawing Terri's feeding tube. But after a long battle, 2005, Terri's husband received the permission to authorize the removal of the feeding tube, and she died soon after. Now, interestingly and discouragingly, so many people who were absolutely ignorant of what was going on with her got involved and tried to say what's the right thing. Politicians, religious groups, different activist groups lobbied that she be kept alive. And after she died, they did an autopsy to check her condition, and they found that most of her brain was damaged, which means that a lot of it was changed into white matter, kind of material, underwent changes which made it impossible for Terri to ever wake up again and to have a personality, because a lot of things go into having a personality: a well-functioning memory, higher order thinking and emotional abilities, sympathy, empathy, being able to plan for the future, think about counterfactual, a lot of reasoning and logical skills that we use all the time unconsciously, but we still have and develop at different stages of life. Now, all of the parts of the brain which enable our minds to do this were gone in Terri's case. So, her life was basically protracted for no good reason, and it's obvious that she ceased to be a conscious person who could recover a long time ago. Of course, this doesn't mean that her parents should be blamed or people who acted in good faith, but it does mean that you should be very, very careful with how you take a stance on these issues. And often the long legal cases, the different judges have huge responsibility to consider the circumstances very carefully. Right, so this was basically a case of euthanasia, where Terri was allowed to die in the end, and the medical stance is that even in such cases, it's not the doctor who should decide, right? This connects to the idea of autonomy. Patient autonomy is very important, and either the patient or the patient's family, as you mentioned, maybe the partner or adult children or parents and wider family should decide. Of course, physicians can offer advice, guidance, and should consult with the family extensively, but the decision has to lie with the people who are in the best position, ideally, to know what would be the best interest of the patient. Now, some people say that there is not much difference between active and passive euthanasia, so countries or states which don't allow active euthanasia, right, very few do, are basically just making a distinction that is not a real distinction. Often the distinction between passive and active euthanasia is drawn in terms of intentions or aims. One of the ways of doing this is relying on the doctrine of double effect. The doctrine of double effect says that an act of harm, an act of significant harm, is impermissible if the intention is to harm and the agent knows that harm will be done. Right, so if intentionally and knowingly we are aiming at harm, that of course is impermissible. But an act of significant harm is permissible. There are further conditions, okay, but this is the basic scheme. An act of significant harm is permissible if the intention is to achieve a reasonable goal, and the harm is a side effect that is foreseen but not intended. So what does this mean? It means basically that if you are a physician, you cannot aim intentionally to kill someone, because this would be significant harm. You cannot do this intentionally and knowingly. But if you are a physician, your patient is in very significant pain, and you want to achieve a reasonable goal, like easing their pain, you might use a larger amount of some painkiller that might, in a weak, ill person, slow down their breathing too much or lead to their heart stopping as a side effect. You might foresee that this is a likely side effect, but this is not what you intend. You don't intend to kill the patient, you just want to save the patient from pain. Right? So some people think that these two cases are really quite different, and because of this, passive euthanasia, which is a bit like this type of action, is permissible, whereas active euthanasia, which would be this first type of action on according to people proposing this distinction, would not be permissible. Now, of course, many people doubt that this is a really meaningful and significant distinction. One of the reasons is that often we can think about cases of neglect when we don't harm someone by doing something, but we might still be guilty, it might still be impermissible. So letting something happen might just be as bad as harming someone intentionally. Let's say you forget to take your child out and you leave them in a overheated car. They become dehydrated and die. You didn't do anything to kill the child. It was neglect. You forgot to do something, actually. You did negative action in that sense. But it is, of course, your fault that the child died, and it would be a reasonable expectation that you do not make this kind of mistake. You're not negligent in these ways if you're a child. So you're just as responsible as if you would have actively killed the child in some other way. And also the other way around, just because you're aiming at a reasonable goal, if you know that the side effect will be brought about, it is very hard to see how you don't kill the patient. Your action seems to be one that we can redescribe as a killing, because even though maybe you didn't intentionally kill the patient, you certainly did voluntarily. You knew that the killing is going to occur, the patient's death is going to occur, and this was compatible with your values and your considered rational, voluntarily performed actions. And I would argue, and some other philosophers as well, that voluntariness is enough, is not the same as intentionality, and voluntariness is enough to render an action, render someone responsible and blame and praiseworthy and accountable for an action. So the DD wouldn't do its job in keeping the two kinds of cases apart, if that's true. You can think of many other cases, of course. And I just want to mention maybe one more, very quickly, have a quick look at this overview. Some states in the US allow people to have physician-assisted suicide, which is basically a form of active euthanasia, where it's not necessarily the physician who performs the act or acts in a way that kills you, but the physician helps you. For example, the physician prepares a medicine that then you or someone who's in your family can inject or use to die with dignity, right? That's the point. People should be able, according to this kind of laws, to end their life at a point where they can still mostly feel that they have autonomy, right? One of the horrible things about disease, especially when it occurs suddenly and severely or in old age, is that it might destroy a lot of your abilities that make you the kind of person who you are. If you're someone from whom being an active person, working in your business, keeping in touch with your friends, looking after your family, children, maybe doing some like sports or going for a hike, going for a walk is very important. These things are a core of your life. Then long hospital stay where your health gradually fails and you become unable to do even quite simple things, and usually this goes hand in hand with what is called cognitive decline, so a mental breakdown where gradually you can think less and less well, gradually you can enjoy art, entertainment, reading, music, movies, and the company of the people who love you less and less. And some people just don't want to get to that point. In some cases there would be also too much pain. In these cases, sometimes permissible in some states to receive a physician-assisted suicide. So this is up until 2021, and there are 10 states in the US where you can have an assisted physician-assisted suicide. It's just very interesting, right? So It's a small part of the US. What do doctors think? So this is an interesting survey. Should physician-assisted suicide be allowed? If you ask people in the US, 54% say yes, 31% no, 15% depends. In Europe, interestingly, a larger number of people said no. So this is from 2014. One of the interesting things for me here is that if you look at rates of serious religious belief, they're higher in the US, and especially for Christians. Suicide is usually a big no-no, but nevertheless, there's a higher number of this. Perhaps this has to do with the history. Euthanasia just and state-sanctioned dying has a bad history in Europe. If you look at things around the Second World War. Would you give life-sustaining therapy if you considered it futile? Europe and US, only 19 says yes, most 35 no. Most people say it depends, right? Would you go against the family's wishes and continue treating a patient whom you felt had a chance to recover? So you feel that the patient can still recover. The family says, look, probably not. It's okay to let them die. A lot of people says no, I would not, which is a bit scary, but most people say it depends. They would want to see the circumstances and how likely it is that the patient has a chance to recover, right? Interesting results. And there might be several reasons why this is the pattern that we get. But it also shows that, when we are asking doctors to perform euthanasia, for a lot of people this is not an easy thing. And sometimes people are a bit arrogant and forget that the physicians, nurses, doctors, and others, medical decision makers, judges, administrators, psychologists, they're also humans, and it can be quite harrowing and difficult for them to have to be part of these proceedings. So we see that there is an interesting distribution of preferences among physicians. Right, the Netherlands system that I mentioned at the beginning, the number of patients involved rose from 5,000 to 7,000 in 2015. I imagine this is yearly. In 1991, 0.7% of all deaths were the result of euthanasia, whereas in 2015, 4.5%. So this looks big, but I think given that in developed and high-income countries, the largest number of people die alone in a hospital, it's actually not too much, because often those people are alone and they suffer for a long time or exist for a long time under circumstances that are probably their quality of life is very, very, very low. So I think this is actually going to rise in the future. In 2015, physician help in dying was requested by 8.3% of all deceased persons. So not everyone who, actually quite a big number, about half of the people who requested to be allowed this kind of death was denied for some reason. And right, at the ending of life, it had an explicit request from patients in this 25-year period, decreased from 0.8% to 0.3%. So explicit request is interesting. So probably some of these deaths are based on previous considerations. Someone made a will, a testament, or some other legal instrument that allowed their family or their legal representative to help end their life. And that went down. The number of people who can themselves request the process went up. So probably a lot of people wait less They don't wait until they fall into a coma or have to be put into long-term sleep to avoid very severe pain or panic attacks and other horrible things that people go through at the end of life. Morphine is one of the choices for terminal sedation in a large number of cases, and most of the people who received physician-assisted suicide had some serious disease. Right. A small number of people requested euthanasia due to dementia and psychiatric problems, which is interesting. Okay. Right. Another thing, in the end, one of the things is, of course, we can make rational arguments for and against euthanasia, but culture and social views, social discussions will always be a big part of how it's legally regulated. Morality is one thing, whether it's right or wrong. I think most arguments point quite conclusively to the idea that it's morally right to allow active euthanasia if the safeguards are strong enough, and it's not an easy thing to get. However, religion, social views, different aspects of social reality, and people's perceptions of social reality and ideas, which might not be what is really the case, might change how people think about this, and as a result, how lawmakers like politicians regulate this. So when people were asked the question, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, do you think doctors should be allowed by law to end the patient's life by some painless means if the patient and his or her family requested? And a lot of people say yes, especially younger people, interestingly, who are a bit further away from the end of life. Maybe people underestimate how much they can still enjoy life at the end, or how hard it is to say goodbye to life. And if you look at people who attend church weekly, most people say no. If you ask people who don't attend church, not so religious, most of them say yes. Regardless of whether or not you think it should be legal, please tell me whether you personally believe that in general it is morally acceptable and morally wrong. How about doctor-assisted suicide? And you can see, interestingly, a lot of people say that yes, people should be allowed a painless death, but some of them think, well, but I'm not sure it's morally acceptable, which is interesting. It might be due, if this is US based, America, it might be due to the fact that around 50% of people in the US are quite seriously religious, so that might be why a lot of people say, I would want to have a painless death, or I would want my family members to have it, but I do know that based on my religion or personal conviction, this is not necessarily moral. If you're not religious, then of course the questions you ask around whether this is moral or not are different, right? For a religious person, usually what matters is what the commandments, the moral rules of their religion are. So in religions of the book, like Islam or Christianity or Judaism, people try to deduce from the written core texts what are the core moral rules. But if you're not religious, then you have to rely on some other sources of morality. If you're a realist about morality, you might rely on what kind of abilities, autonomy, freedom, and other values and important aspects of life are present for humans, and base your criteria on that. So, for example, someone who's a deontologist could say that every human person's life is immensely valuable, so euthanasia and suicide should only be permissible if it realizes respect for the person and their autonomy. So maybe at the point where the person would disintegrate, or their life would really become so painful that they would not be able to exist as an autonomous human being anymore, it makes sense, but up to that point No. Utilitarians, consequentialists would judge differently, right? For a utilitarian, like Peter Singer, they would look at the overall consequences, how much increase in well-being is produced overall by the request. So they would try to calculate how good this is for the person, the affected physicians, the family, other people connected to the person, and overall which course of action has the better outcome, right? Um, right, and this is, I think, where we're going to end for today. If you're interested, the resources for those on my course are available. If you're not on my course, then I do recommend you to check out this wonderful bioethics book by Vaughn. And if you have any questions, please post it in comments. And those of you who are on the course are going to receive a question that you'll have to answer as an assignment. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for joining me for a short overview of this very important and very interesting topic that affects at some point many of us, either directly or through the lives of our family and the end of life. Have a great day and take care of yourselves.